Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed. Okay, so we're jumping straight into this. A significant phone conversation happened recently, May 19th, between the U.S. president and the Russian president.
Right.
What we want to do now is, pull out the key takeaways based on what's been reported.
Well, the first thing that really jumps out is the reported atmosphere of the call.
Oh, how so?
We're hearing from the Kremlin side that the U.S. president spoke, pretty emotionally about the future of relations between the two countries.
Emotionally. Interesting.
Yeah, apparently he sees Russia as a really key partner for America, especially economically, trade-wise.
Huh. That's fascinating, especially when you think about the other context, like this new sanctions bill floating around the Senate.
Exactly. He's aware of it, reportedly.
But he'd rather make deals.
That seems to be the preference, yes. Reports suggest he wants to find common ground, reach agreements, rather than just, pile on more sanctions. It does make you think about the strategy there.
For sure. And this wasn't just a random call, was it?
No, not at all. To really get this, you need to see it as part of a sequence. This was actually the third phone conversation between them since the U.S. president's inauguration.
The third one.
Yeah.
And this latest one, May 19th, was pretty long.
Oh, yeah. 2 hours and 5 minutes.
Why?
And the previous ones weren't short either. March 18th was around 2 hours. And back in February 12th, that was about an hour and a half.
So quite a bit of direct talk time at the very top.
A significant amount. And what's really striking is how communication seems to have, revived since the U.S. president returned to the White House.
Between Washington and Moscow, you mean?
Exactly. Those channels had gone pretty quiet, especially after the military operation in Ukraine began.
Right. And it's not just these big presidential calls, is it?
No, it seems much broader. We're talking expert talks, high-level meetings, specialists visiting.
Even meetings in neutral spots.
Yes. And apparently there have been over 15 confirmed contacts between officials from both sides just since the beginning of February.
15. Okay, that really does show a renewed effort.
And think about this. The first full-scale negotiations between Russia and the U.S. in 3 years happened in Saudi Arabia back on February 18th.
What was on the table there?
Big stuff. The conflict in Ukraine, obviously, but also things like getting the embassies in both capitals fully staffed and operational again.
Practical things, too. And didn't someone from Russia visit Washington recently?
Yes. Kirill Dmitriev, he's the Russian president's special representative for investment and economic cooperation. He was in D.C. in early April.
And there was something about sanctions being lifted for that.
Temporarily, yes. That's what was reported.
Yeah.
Which maybe suggests a bit of flexibility to make these talks happen.
Going back a bit to March, maybe. Yeah. Wasn't the U.S. president saying something about having good relations with the Russian president?
He did mention that, yeah. Even while stressing the U.S. had a firm stance on things. And apparently the Russian president confirmed the U.S. administration wanted to resume dialogue.
So the will to talk seemed mutual, at least back then.
It seems so. But, we also need to balance that.
How so?
Well, in April, the Russian president's press secretary talked about how difficult restoring relations would be. Basically, starting from scratch, expecting slow progress.
Okay. So wanting dialogue, but also recognizing it's a steep climb?
Pretty much. Which brings us naturally to sanctions.
Right. What's the latest on that front?
Well, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio apparently said the administration had warned Russia for 2 months about tougher sanctions if there wasn't progress on a Ukraine settlement.
And the U.S. president prefers not to use them, but they're still an option.
That seems to be the message. Preference for agreements, but sanctions aren't off the table.
In Europe, were they also talking sanctions?
Yes, reportedly some European countries were considering new ones if Russia didn't agree to a ceasefire.
And Russia's position on all this?
Consistent. They say they want a long-term peaceful solution, but they reject any demands that sound like ultimatums.
Yeah, they've been pretty clear on that.
And quite skeptical about the threat of sanctions, too. The Kremlin, I mean. The Russian president was even quoted calling those who impose them, idiots.
Okay. So not easily pressured by that, it seems.
Doesn't look like it.
So shifting back to this specific call on the 19th, what was a key outcome?
A big one seems to be this idea of a memorandum. The Russian president mentioned after the call that Russia is ready to work on a memorandum with Ukraine that would include a ceasefire.
A memorandum for a ceasefire. What would that entail?
It sounds like more than just a temporary stop. The goal, reportedly, is to lay down principles for a peaceful settlement overall, maybe set timelines for a peace agreement, and yes, include a possible temporary ceasefire if they reach those broader agreements.
So finding compromises is key.
That's what the Russian president emphasized, finding compromises that work for everyone and figuring out the best way to actually, move towards peace.
How did he describe the call with the U.S. president?
Substantive, frank, and very useful. He also apparently thanked the U.S. for its part in helping restart direct talks between Russia and Ukraine.
Right. Those talks had stalled.
They had. And this call, the third one, lasting over 2 hours, came just after those Russia-Ukraine talks in Istanbul on May 15th.
Talks initiated by the Kremlin.
Right, reportedly, yes. And Istanbul seemed to produce some concrete results.
Like the prisoner exchange.
Exactly. A large-scale one, 1,000 for 1,000, was the agreement, and also discussions about preparing ceasefire conditions from each side with more dialogue to follow.
And the U.S. president was keeping allies in the loop.
Seems so. Planned to call the Ukrainian president NATO leaders right after talking to the Russian president.
And we heard something about the U.S. plan itself.
Yes. Keith Kellogg, the U.S. president's special envoy, reportedly said the first point of the U.S. plan is a comprehensive ceasefire. That's the starting point.
Meanwhile, Moscow's saying they want peace, but no ultimatums.
Right. The press secretary reiterated that commitment to a long-term settlement but rejected ultimatum language. He also mentioned Europe's very open opposition to Moscow.
So the ceasefire idea is generally supported by the Russian president, but with caveats.
Seems like it. His press secretary said there are still many questions that need answers.
Okay. And did they discuss prisoner exchanges during the call itself?
They did, according to a Russian aide, talked about a potential new exchange, 9 for 9 people.
And there was one recently, wasn't there, in April?
Yes, April 10th in Abu Dhabi. That involved Karolina, a dual Russian-American citizen.
Convicted of treason, right?
Correct. And Artur Petrov, a Russian-German citizen, indicted in the U.S. for smuggling and other charges.
And Mark Vogel was transferred earlier, too.
Yes, back in February after serving time in Russia for drug smuggling. So these exchanges are definitely part of the ongoing dynamic.
Okay, so if we summarize the Russian president's take on the call, Ukraine was central.
Yes.
Ready for a ceasefire memorandum if agreements are reached. Thank the U.S. for help restarting direct talks with Ukraine, which Kiev had stopped in 2022.
Right, that point was made.
And he heard the U.S. president's views on a truce, found the talk frank and substantive.
That seems to cover his reported perspective.
Now, what about the U.S. president's view? How did he describe it?
Very positively. He called it very good, with an excellent tone and spirit.
Quite optimistic then.
Extremely. He even claimed Russia and Ukraine would immediately start negotiations on a ceasefire and ending the war.
Immediately, wow.
Yeah, saying the conditions would be worked out by the two sides because they know the details, others don't.
Did he mention anything else, like potential locations for talks?
He did. He mentioned the Vatican, saying the Pope had expressed strong interest in hosting negotiations.
Interesting. And he talked about trade, too.
Yes, suggesting increased trade between the U.S. and Russia after the conflict would be beneficial for both, and could even help with Ukraine's post-war reconstruction.
And who did he brief afterwards?
Quite a few leaders. The Ukrainian president, head of the European Commission, French president, Italian PM, German chancellor, and the Finnish president, keeping everyone informed.
So this call happened right after those Istanbul talks on May 16th.
May 15th were the talks. The call was the 19th, but yes, closely following them.
Right. And those Istanbul talks had the big prisoner exchange agreement and the ceasefire discussions.
Correct. And U.S. officials, including Secretary Rubio, were actually in Istanbul.
But they didn't join the Russia-Ukraine talks directly.
No, they met separately with Turkish and Ukrainian officials beforehand, trilaterally.
How did Moscow view the Istanbul meeting?
Quite positively, it seems. The Russian Direct Investment Fund called the outcomes good results. The exchange, the ceasefire options discussion, understanding positions, continued dialogue.
And they credited the U.S. president.
Partially, yes. Credited him and his team for contributing to that progress.
And just before the big call, weren't some U.S. officials meeting with the Ukrainian president?
Yes. Vice President J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio met him in Rome on May 18th.
What did they discuss?
Ongoing ceasefire talks, lasting peace. There was even a photo of them laughing together.
So a lot of diplomatic activity leading up to this presidential call.
Definitely. The U.S. president had even announced on the 17th he planned to call the Russian president, focusing on trade and ending the fighting in Ukraine, and that he'd talk to Ukraine and NATO, too.
And there was a call between Foreign Minister Lavrov and Secretary Rubio.
Yes, just before the presidential one, Rubio reportedly welcomed the prisoner exchange deal, and the State Department was pushing the U.S. peace plan as the best path forward.
Okay, let's touch on that U.S. peace plan. What are the reported details?
Well, according to reports, it suggests recognizing Russian sovereignty over Crimea
Okay.
and Russia's de facto control over certain areas in eastern and southern Ukraine.
What about Ukraine's security?
Security guarantees are proposed in exchange for Ukraine not joining NATO, but potentially still joining the EU.
And the Zaporizhia nuclear plant?
The suggestion reported is Kyiv keeps ownership, but the U.S. handles restarting and operating it.
And sanctions, what about those?
This is a big one. The plan reportedly includes canceling sanctions imposed on Russia since 2014.
Wow, canceling them. But what if talks fail?
Then the threat is increased sanctions. There's apparently a bill from a Republican senator with high tariffs on goods from countries buying Russian energy, banning U.S. citizens from buying Russian debt.
And that has support.
Significant congressional support, reportedly. Yeah. Plus, new European sanctions were also expected. So really two very different potential outcomes hanging in the balance.
It paints a picture of high-stakes diplomacy.
Absolutely.
So just to recap the history quickly, this May 19th call was the third since the U.S. president took office.
Correct. The first was February 12th after an envoy visit and a prisoner swap.
Yeah.
Topics then included Ukraine, bilateral ties, Middle East, Iran.
And the second call, March 18th.
Yes. That's when the Russian president raised concerns about a ceasefire proposal. But they did agree on that temporary pause in strikes on energy infrastructure.
Which later led to accusations of violations.
Unfortunately, yes. Mutual accusations followed. And it's worth remembering, during the U.S. president's first term, they met 6 times, including that Helsinki summit in 2018.
So there's a history of engagement there, despite everything.
There is. It provides a backdrop, for these current complex communications.
So wrapping up this deep dive on the May 19th call, we've looked at the reported emotional tone on future relations.
Right. The focus on that potential peace memorandum for Ukraine, including a ceasefire.
The ongoing prisoner exchange talks.
And just the sheer amount of diplomatic activity surrounding it before and after.
It gives us a pretty clear snapshot of this moment in the dialogue based on what we know.
Exactly. A snapshot based on the available information. Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.